Governor Mills has vetoed a proposal to end the state's 3 strikes law for people convicted of petty thefts. The proposal from Democratic Representative David Sinclair sought to set a threshold for theft by a repeat offender. Sinclair's proposal stated that a person with 2 or more prior convictions would not be charged with a felony if they committed theft of property valued at $500 or less. Mills vetoed the proposal yesterday, and Mills wrote that the proposal would make Maine an outlier among New England states.